The new book I've just completed was written with two former students of mine, Tom Hale, who's here now at Oxford, and Kevin Young at the University now of Massachusetts. And of course, like all former students, they are now a lot smarter than me. But we wrote this book collectively. That's the point I'm trying to make. And one of the spurs, at least for me, was going to a series of lectures on why the climate negotiations at Copenhagen failed. I must have been at 3 or 4 of these lectures at the LSE shortly after the Copenhagen negotiations collapsed. And the contrast between the urgency of climate change and the pitiful infighting of politicians was all there to see. But yet all the lectures dwelled on issues internal to climate change. In other words, they tried to explain the failures of climate change by internal reference to climate change politics. In other words, the matter was treated sui generis. But the more of these lectures I went to, the more I began to think there's something that cross-cuts the failure of international negotiations at this time. And we could have substituted Copenhagen for the Doha round, for financial market reform, for reform of intellectual property rights, and so on. So there was a bigger question here. Why had the post-war era come to a cul-de-sac in some sense? A cul-de-sac at just that time, as it were, where globalization has reshaped the world into a world of what I call overlapping communities of fate, where the fate and fortunes of countries are very much intertwined. So why at this moment, when we need effective and responsive global governance, are we in fact finding in negotiation after negotiation failure? And I discussed this at length with Tom and Kevin, and Gridlock is the outcome. Gridlock is both a theoretical book and an empirical book. It's theoretical in the sense that I think it does deliver a new theory of why it is that global negotiations can come to nothing. And then that theory is applied in 3 areas: economy, security, and the environment. Let's start from the beginning very briefly. I'll give a very short synopsis. Essentially what the book says is that the post-war era, the post-war institutions, that is, the institutions that were created after 1945, were hugely successful. They gave rise to sufficient stability and sufficient predictability in the world economy for more and more countries to enter the global economy, sometimes on their own terms, particularly the big ones, India, China. So you get from 1945 through to the present day a change in the structure of the world economy, from an economy dominated by the US and Europe to an economy where there's a shifting center of economic gravity from west to east. Danny Quah analyzes this extremely well at the LSE. But at the same time, as this growing dynamic world economy, you get the beginnings of global collective action problems that are in some sense are the result of success. Climate change, in some ways, is the result of the success of industrialization. So that we argue there are a series of unintended consequences of the success of the post-war period, which bring the post-war period almost to its knees. Climate change is, I suppose, the biggest issue of all, but around all the areas I mentioned before of international negotiations, they are stalling, and the question is why. So the argument of the book is this is for a number of reasons. There are 4 reasons, each one of which could be an independent explanation for this, but they often run together. The first explanation concerns the shift from unipolarity to a multipolar world. The second one concerns relatively simple issues to growing very complex issues that emerge in an interdependent world. The third one says it's very hard to change institutions because power is embedded in them, and when power of the post-war institutions are contained in institutions, it's hard to get people to change them. And also, institutions can be easily fragmented and divided in terms of attention. Let me give you an example that cuts across this from the environment. It was relatively easy to resolve smog in London and elsewhere in the 1950s, 60s. I'm old enough to remember going to primary school and when the smogs descended on London, not being able to see my hand in the front of my face. To deal with smog in Europe, you needed a few countries to get together around a clearly defined common problem, and if there was a freely given, that is to say, cheap, available alternative, smoke-free coal, then you could easily phase the old coal out and phase the new in. That's what happened. Let's take ozone depletion. 3 or 4 decades later, ozone became an acute problem, a seriously acute problem. But what you had to do is bring a small number of countries together who were the manufacturers of the ozone-damaging chemicals. And it was at that time a good moment to do it because there was a fairly cheap alternative technology available. So a small number of countries with an easily identifiable problem and an alternative. That makes politics possible, coordination possible. Now scale up to climate change. Many countries need to agree about an issue which is very diffuse, around technologies which are unclear with no easy pathway through them. No one can say the pathway from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy is straightforward. So here you have multi-polarity, more voices around an issues which are very complicated, and that multiplies the difficulty of getting agreement. So that would be an example. But we argue essentially that gridlock explains the failure of contemporary negotiations, and it does so because more and more countries have to agree on issues which are incredibly difficult to agree in the context of institutions that are often fragmented, and it's hard to get a positive result out of all of that. So the theory is set up around these terms of reference and then applied to these different areas. It's quite a dark conclusion. I write very optimistic books. This is probably my darkest book, and it basically says it's hard to get out of gridlock. You need leadership in part to get out of gridlock. The US itself is gridlocked. Domestic policy debate in America is hamstrung between the Republicans and Democrats and between conservatives and liberals. It's very hard to get serious change through Congress. Europe is dogged by the euro crisis and the financial fallout of the global financial crisis. And China's self-absorbed with its own economic success and growth, which for China means legitimacy of its political elites. So here you have the 3 biggest power blocks in the world, inward looking, at just the time when we need a new architecture or pathways through gridlock. Given the gridlock environment that I've set out, I think the real issue for students of political science and international relations is to pursue research and PhDs in sectoral areas where you can begin to chart the complexity of international relations in particular sectors, the obstacles to development in those sectors, and perhaps to look at the policy horizons and ways out and beyond those obstacles. I think the way forward is not so much in big theory, but very tailored, specific PhDs and research projects that look at particular areas of global policy and global governance and look at the intersection between demand and supply, the institutions we have, the problems we need resolved, how they match or fail to match, why, and then to look at the policy framework that can perhaps be pushed to resolve some of these very pressing, urgent issues.